Session will explore secure choice and other state-facilitated retirement savings programs for small businesses and their employees who currently do not have access to an employee-sponsored plan. The panel will provide updates on states that have already come online or will do so later this year. They'll explore the effects of legal and congressional activities and how states are evolving and moving forward with new options and plan designs. Please welcome Hank Kim, who will moderate this session and introduce his distinguished panel.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. So we have a lot to cover, and unfortunately, we have just over 30 minutes. So why don't we do this? We'll start off with a quick introduction by each of the panelists. Give us your name, your title, and your role that you play at your organization. So Katie, let's start with you.
Great, good morning, and thank you, Hank. I'm Katie Selenski, the Executive Director of CalSavers, the state of California's new retirement savings program for people in the private sector who don't have access to a plan at work.
David?
Hi, my name is David Morse. I'm a law partner at the firm of K&L Gates, and I've worked with a number of states, including California, on establishing their secure choice programs and also open MEPs.
So just like with the number of other panels that we've had, we certainly want to engage the audience and answer any questions you may have. We're going to start off with some of the topics that we thought would be interesting for you to be aware of, particularly updates on where these state initiatives are. But again, we would like to answer your questions. So sometime in the middle of our presentation, we will have microphones available. And also, I know you may be getting tired of me plugging our app, but if you want to send me your questions via the app, please do so, and we'll be sure to try to answer your question that way. So why don't we start with more of a threshold question for this audience? And I certainly have my view on the answer to this question, which is, as public pension trustees and administrators and stakeholders, why should the folks in this audience care about programs like CalSavers or other state facilitated savings for the private sector?
Sure.
Yeah.
Start. Well, I think as a starting point, we all work on retirement security for workers. So that is one, I think, really important common thread. I think as the previous panel alluded to and the comptroller earlier this morning, to the extent that, and that cartoon illustrated it just now, to the extent that private sector workers are struggling to achieve, to be on a path to retirement security, that one could argue that could bolster criticisms of public pension systems or of that concept of pension envy. So that's not really a positive framing, but that's certainly one reason, I think, for folks on the public pension side to care. To the extent that we're all better off, including workers in the private sector, that ought to, I think, help with public perception and public support for the public pension side. But really, we're all working on retirement security, right? So.
Yeah. How about you, David?
Yeah.
You have a very interesting background, right? You're in addition to helping states work on these programs, your background is as an ERISA attorney working for corporations in the private sector. So how do you answer that question?
Well, actually, I agree with what Katie said, and I think it's important that the private sector also have a stake in retirement planning, and all these uncovered workers are, if they're covered besides the humanitarian reasons and also for the state's economics, the more folks that are part of the system, even through an IRA, the better. The better they'll be engaged and they'll regard this as an important issue.
So let's talk about the sort of the landscape of these private or savings retirement savings facilitated by states for the private sector. What are the various options out there? What are currently enacted? What are various states doing? David, maybe you might want to start here. you start maybe going from east to west, and then maybe Katie can take over west of the Mississippi.
So you said east to west, I'm getting.
Or, yeah, east to west.
Okay, so I guess generally there's three flavors of these programs. One, something called an open MEP standing for multiple employer plan. All it is just a regular ERISA plan, typically a 401k plan, where unrelated employers can join together and share one common platform. The reason for doing it is it's more economical, especially for smaller employers. If they can join forces and have a larger plan, the costs get spread out amongst a lot more participants. Vermont is really the first state to enact a full open MEP law. Their program hasn't been rolled out yet, but they're in the RFP process and looking for a vendor. This would be a program that employers within whatever particular state could voluntarily join. And then there's the secure choice type framework, which including Katie's program, which involves an auto IRA. So just a basic Roth IRA, where typically the employers that don't offer a retirement plan would have to make that program available to their employees, and it would provide for automatic enrollment. So employees who do nothing, so the default is they're going to contribute some percentage of their pay to the program. And then, well, this would then be the West Coast, though, to do the marketplace. So I don't know, am I allowed to talk about the marketplace?
Well, Katie, you want to talk a little bit about the marketplace, or?
I know the least about the marketplace, but
I'm
happy
sorry.
to talk about California.
Yeah,
In
yeah.
a nutshell, in Washington State, they have they don't have an employer mandate, they don't have automatic enrollment, but the state is organizing sort of a clearinghouse of information for providers that may want to, on a large scale, provide access to retirement savings vehicles for workers in the state of Washington. The state is just kind of organizing the platform for getting the word out for those providers. Did I get that right?
Perfect.
Okay.
Well, so Katie, you did mention it, and maybe it bears to be expanded upon. You said employer mandates. What does that mean? And for both of you, what are the pluses and what are the minuses of an employer mandate?
Yep, and just to back up really quick on CalSavers, so as David mentioned, we are one of the automatic enrollment IRA states, and we do have an employer mandate. Our legislation was passed at the end of 2016. Senator De Leon worked for 9 years on the legislation. And just to back up for another second, the real premise of this is that we have nearly half of Californians, working Californians, are projected to retire into economic hardship. And so that was really the problem that the authorizing legislation was seeking to address. So the legislation does come with an employer mandate, and it says that for all non-governmental employers in the state of California with 5 or more employees, if you don't already offer some kind of retirement savings vehicle, and we're not talking about pension or even necessarily an employer match, just some kind of savings vehicle. If you don't already offer one, you must either go find one on the marketplace just like you can right now, or facilitate access to CalSavers. And I think that as David said, there are lots of models out there, and I think all of them are good, and it's all indicative of progress that's happening across the country. I am biased and think that the employer mandate is a good thing and will help nudge small businesses into helping their employees. And really, we hear from small businesses that there are 3 primary reasons that they're not currently offering access to a plan. One, the fees that they, as the plan sponsor, would have to pay to the providers. 2, the administrative burden of finding that plan, figuring it out, doing the research, understanding it, administering it. And then 3, the fiduciary liability. Those are 3 hurdles that CalSavers, we address all 3 of those. So we hope that, we would hope that even without the mandate, that many small businesses would, take advantage of this as an opportunity for them to provide a benefit and a way for their folks to be on a path to retirement security. But we know that, the small business owners are busy and they're, not only the head mechanic, but, the HR person and the salesperson, and, they're wearing a lot of hats and juggling a lot. So having the nudge of the mandate, I think will be very powerful.
So that's the positive of mandate. David, are there any downsides of a mandate, and what are the positives of more of a voluntary program?
Well, I think there's two issues with the mandate. One's the political, philosophical one. It's like, okay, the states are now imposing another requirement on small businesses, and they just don't have the bandwidth to do that. I think so far with Oregon, which is the first program that's actually gone live, and Illinois, which is starting to, as of yesterday, register employers, they're finding out that the burden on small employers is probably pretty small. It's the software is there, especially with employers that have their own use a payroll vendor or payroll software. It's not proving too difficult to and time-consuming for employers to join up. Another fear was that small employers that had a 401k plan would just terminate them and just throw them into the state auto IRA program. It's early on, but so far that's not happening. If anything, it's the other way around. That's at least the experience in Oregon, where some employers decided, hey, if I'm going to do this, I might as well go all out, and they actually adopted a 401k plan. And then finally, there's the ERISA issue, which boils down to if these state auto IRA programs are considered an ERISA-regulated retirement plan, then the state mandate is likely preempted by ERISA, which would take the legs out of the program. We spent a lot of time on that issue in my firm, and of course, working with states like California, and have concluded very strongly that these programs are not ERISA plans, so that the ERISA preemption issue, if it were ever litigated, the states would win.
Great. So let's get into some of the updates. So this time last year, we did have Lisa Messina join us, and she was very excited about the prospect of rolling out Oregon Saves. Mm-hmm. Now we're more than or almost a year in, and how are they doing?
I think the latest update on Oregon that I saw is that they have $3 million in the bank. So they had launched their pilot last summer and fall, and I can't remember the number of savers they have. I think it's 20,000 something. But over $3 million has been saved by people who are working, by and large, for small businesses in Oregon, which is pretty exciting.
Yeah. David, and how about in Illinois? You referenced them starting to enroll employers. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Okay. Their pilot program is just opening up, and I think they've got 15 or so employers that are going to join. They're going to start taking money in July, and I think it's important. What the states have been doing is just rolling it out very slowly, making sure everything works before they start bringing in a lot of employers.
And California update?
Yes. California.
So as for CalSavers, we, like I said, our legislation was passed at the end of 2016. I was appointed about a year ago, so we spent the second half of 2017 really working to engage intensively with stakeholders and hear from them really what do they want to see in the program? What do they want the design features to look like? What was important to them? Roth, traditional, default settings, default contribution rates, automatic escalation, all of those kinds of features. And then we, engaged with our board and wrote regulations to reflect all of that feedback that we got. And at the end of February, our board, approved regulations. We approved a governance policy. On Monday, we're about to approve an investment policy statement. And for us, we're hoping to launch at the end of, with a pilot at the end of 2018, and all of the timing around that hinges on our ability to hire a third-party administrator. And we are about to start the solicitation for that firm or firms very soon. So hoping to launch the pilot at the end of the calendar year, and then launching with a 3-year phased rollout statewide in early to mid 2019. So we're rolling out by employer size, starting with the largest employers and going down to the smallest employers over a 3-year period.
Great. David?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I just think what Katie and the other states have done is just so important. It's not like some faceless bureaucrat, pouring more burdens on small employers. They're actually out there listening and adjusting their programs so that it's user-friendly, it's easy.
Yeah, and thank you for saying that. And we've tried really hard to be very sensitive to the small business owners' feedback. We understand that our success will hinge on our ability to reach them, make them aware of the program, make sure that they know how to comply with the requirements, and really, truly, we want it to be as easy as possible for them, because all of our success, I think, depends on their cooperation and their ability to see it as a benefit and as a positive thing.
So let's shift the gears just a little bit forward. And we already know, as we mentioned earlier, that there are 10 states that have enacted, currently 2 states that have implemented, third's CalSavers, almost there. What are the lessons learned, particularly relative to standing up and funding these offices? David, let me start with you. As you're consulting and working with these various states, how are states funding and financing the startups of these offices? And then, Katie, I would love to hear about how California did it.
Yeah, I would say just generally, I think the states want these programs to be completely zero cost to the taxpayer so that the programs pay for themselves. Usually the state will lend money to the program, because obviously until you start taking money in, you don't have anything to cover your costs. They've also gotten, a fair amount of grants from organizations to help do the initial economic research. And then over time, with the record keeper and with all the other vendors and service providers, as assets accumulate, there'll be enough money to repay those loans, and the programs will be able to run on their own.
Katie, and then how did California start your program, and what were the hurdles or the benefits of that model?
Yep. So going back to 2012, the first iteration of the legislation was actually passed in 2012, and it required that before a final version be legislatively authorized, that a feasibility study be done, fiscal feasibility study be done. And even that could not cost the taxpayers a single dime according to the legislation. So our board was constituted at that point, and then worked hard to raise money from the philanthropic sector to pay for that feasibility study. That was done, and then the legislation was passed. But as David said, on an ongoing basis, our statute requires that we not cost a single dime to taxpayers. And I think, the positive side of that is that it made for a really nice, tidy message when they were politically trying to get the legislation through the process. And it worked, and it was successful. The hard part is that we have startup costs, and the costs are higher at the beginning, both for the staff and for the record keeper and the third-party administrator. And really, when you think about it, we have one source of so we're operating right now on a startup loan from the legislature that we have to pay back with interest, and we have one source of revenue to pay that back, and that's fees on our savers, on our participants. And by and large, these are low-income folks with volatile income, and some of whom have never even had a bank account before. So we have every interest in keeping fees as low as humanly possible for them. And so it is challenging that there's no appropriation for this, because those startup costs, even just the costs of outreach and marketing, that will be really important. It'll be really important that we invest in outreach and marketing. But all of that is going to come out of the pockets of our savers. So it's understand why it was done that way. If I had a magic wand, I would ask for an appropriation to fund some of these activities. I will say that we do spend a fair amount of time right now encouraging philanthropic organizations to directly support our grassroots nonprofit partners who will really be the trusted influencers and the trusted voices in communities to help to get the word out. So we're trying to fundraise, not for us, not for the state, but for our partners to help offset some of those costs.
Let's talk a little bit about fees since we are broaching it. Obviously, fees are very important and a hot topic in the public plan community. What are the limitations on fees, specifically in California, and David, more nationally with the other states that you worked with? Is there legislation on fees?
In our statute in California, by the end of year 6 of operation, our fees have to be capped at 1%, and that sounds really high, I know, to everyone in the room. Sounds high to me. We have every intention of being well below 1% at the outset from launch. Like I said, we are seeking, we're about to start our solicitation for the program administrator, and I say this all the time. We expect, because we're the largest state, and because of the volume and the opportunity that this presents to vendors, to our future partners, that we expect to have the lowest fees, and expect to be well below that statutory limit right at the outset.
And David, what are you seeing nationwide?
Yeah, I think it's either, as California has, there's a statutory fee cap, or like the New York bill that just passed, that they just have to keep, requirement to keep fees as low as possible, but with no specific dollar limit. I mean, I think one thing I'd like to see is states start to think of, especially the smaller states, either joining together so that they can achieve a higher critical mass, or being able to join with the huge plans like California, where they could just take advantage of that whole built-in infrastructure and spread the fees over more mouths.
I will say, speaking of built-in infrastructure, because of the work that California did in terms of the feasibility study, it was really the catalyst that allowed some of the other smaller states who are implementing to be where they are, in that because of the work that you already put in, that they could either piggyback on it or do less of a deeper dive than otherwise would have had to been done. So I think there's some of that sort of built-in effort already. So while these are state-based efforts, there is obviously a federal government and federal oversight in some measure. And to what degree has the federal government been helpful or unhelpful? David, we'll start with you, and then we'll talk about what's going on in California.
Okay, well, I guess the federal government hasn't been particularly helpful. What's the history, at least with the auto IRAs, like California's program, is that there was a series of ERISA safe harbors that date back to 1975 that said employer-based withholding IRA programs aren't covered by ERISA. In 2016, the Obama administration, Department of Labor, issued additional regulations that provided sort of a belts and suspenders second safe harbor for the states. That regulation was disapproved by the Trump administration and the Republican Congress last year. And the way the statute works is that when a regulation is approved, it's basically a complete do-over. So it's like it doesn't exist anymore. So it's back to the original 1975 safe harbor, which I think was adequate. Unfortunately, the other thing that the Trump administration did was they also eliminated the MyRA programs, or the government IRA, that hadn't really taken off yet, but now that's gone. I think that would have been helpful for some states. And in terms of like a national program, I mean, in a perfect world, if we had that magic wand, there would be a national IRA or some kind of savings vehicle. But I think the likelihood of that happening is probably minuscule.
Yeah. And Katie, in California, how are you dealing with these challenges, if they are? And then in terms of potential lawsuits? How are you thinking about that at all?
Sure, we think about it. I'll say the day after Trump signed the CRA repeal of the DOL rule last May, State Treasurer John Chung, who's the chair of our board, and Senator De Leon, who's the author of the legislation, had a press conference and waved around the opinion from K&L Gates, saying that we're still on strong legal footing, and said we're charging ahead and didn't need that rule anyway. So we're boldly going forward, and we think we're on very solid legal ground to do that. And I would say just, from a more practical basis, we talk to the Chamber of Commerce and other kind of business advocacy organizations in the state regularly, and have invited them to be on our employer working group to help advise us on the regulations and the design of the program, and they've been at the table with us. So to the extent that they may have concerns, they're with us, they're giving their feedback on the design of the program. I'm not saying they'll be 100% happy with the design at the end of the day, but they're working with us, and we're doing everything we can to make it as easy as possible on employers. So beyond that, we think we have a really strong program that is going to be so beneficial to both employers and employees that any rumblings about worries of burdens on the employers will be alleviated, and beyond that, we have David. So.
Katie, you had some a
yes.
slide that you would like to show. So
Thank
hopefully
you.
our crack technicians can have the PowerPoint on the screen.
Yes, thank you. I just want to show you one slide just to brag about what we're talking about here. This is the problem side. You heard about this already. We don't need to go over that. But if you can see this, this is a projection for the amount of savings that a saver in a particular scenario would have at the end of their career. And I want to shout out to my wonderful program consultant, AKF Consulting, led by Andrea Fierstein, who's in the room if you want to talk to someone who knows a lot about this stuff. The underlying math for this chart came from them. And what this shows is that for a worker who starts at age 25 in CalSavers and stays in the program their whole career for 40 years till age 65, at a salary of starting salary of $30,000, which is in a year and a half from now will be the minimum wage in California. They will have, over that 40 years, at the end of the day, $350,000, 1/3 of which came from their own contributions and 2/3 coming from the earnings on their investments. And this is a person who would participate at the default settings. So again, people can opt out entirely, or they can change the default settings, the contribution rate, to whatever they want. But this is a person participating at the default, which is 5% payroll contributions. We're assuming that they get a 1% salary increase a year, and the contributions are escalated in the first 3 years by 1%, so that by year 4 they're at 8%. So I just thought that was a helpful depiction of what the impact of this could be.
Great, thank you. So we have just over 5 minutes. So again, if you have any questions, we have folks in the room with the microphone. So I do see a hand raised back there, but before we, as the mic is being walked over there, we did get a question over the app, and the question is, what happens if an employer goes bankrupt and they need to withdraw from CalSavers or any of these state-facilitated programs?
The employer's bankruptcy is really not relevant to CalSavers or any of these programs. All it is a certain amount is being withheld from each employee's wage and is contributed to an IRA in that employee's name. So it's very personal. That employee owns the IRA. This isn't a pension plan where it can be underfunded or where the employer contributes. In fact, employers aren't allowed to contribute to these programs. So while the bankruptcy might be bad news for a lot of reasons, it's not bad news in terms of CalSavers or another auto IRA.
And can I take another
Yes.
another magic wand comment? If I could change ERISA, I would allow employer contributions into this plan, but as of now, we're not allowed to take them.
So there was a question from the
Yeah.
audience?
40 years and $350,000 doesn't seem like, it seems like peanuts. That should probably last about, if 5 years. But the question is, how do you provide health care? What happens in terms of health care after 40 years, $350,000? What happens in terms of health care?
So I think that, just to paraphrase, I think there's two questions. One, just a general comment about the size of the assets, and then a related question about retiree health care.
On the size of the assets, it's absolutely correct. It's not going to solve the retirement security crisis in the country alone. We don't pretend that it will. But, you know, there's a bunch of really interesting research that's going on out there. You know, if you use these secure choice pots of money, even just as bridge funding to to extend your Social Security drawdown date, research shows that for every year we delay drawing on Social Security, we get 7 to 8 percentage points bump in that Social Security income. So, you know, I think that as we proceed, we'll think of, you know, creative ways that these pots of money could be applied, but it's absolutely true. This is not the panacea to the retirement savings crisis. On retiree health, we might be able to get to that in stage 2 of this, but right now we have not contemplated retiree health as part of this.
Another question?
Yes, James Brock, Palm Bay Police and Fire Department. My question was, I was looking at trying to provide something for our staff because they're not connected with our members and they don't have a retirement system. We were looking at trying to get them some sort of 401k locally in Florida, and if we didn't have at least 50 members, it wasn't a viable option. And I was trying to think of what you were doing with something that we could have that would be small, nimble, they could carry with them, would act like a 401k, because they're good staff. I want to retain them, but if we keep them for 20 or 30 years, they're going to be the other person outside of that cartoon. They don't have a pension. And I'd like them to have that, so when they are done, they've got something like a 401k they can contribute to their Roth IRA, and then they could use their Social Security. That's my question.
So, so in Florida, currently there is no legislation, but if there were, you know, what advice would you offer relative to state-facilitated savings?
So if there was something, it seems like it's unfortunate that you haven't been able to find any 401k vendor at a reasonable price. Maybe, just as an aside, maybe take a look at the Washington State website, the marketplace. Maybe some of those vendors could help outside of Washington State. But I think what you're asking about, what if Florida allowed an open map so that it would be easy, user-friendly, sort of a pension in box, as Hank calls it, to make available for organizations like yours. I think that would be great. But at the moment, there's nothing in Florida.
So I would, you know, one of the things I would suggest is either, you know, going to Tallahassee and suggesting an IRA type of program, or it seems as if, you know, you want something a little bit more robust than sort of the initial, you know, what we consider to be a very first step in terms of retirement security. And if that's the case, maybe the better legislation for Florida is to have a marketplace where the state mandates that, you know, the fees would be at X amount, and, you know, you have to cover X number of employees or something to that effect. So that might be an approach. Any other questions from the audience? So we have about just over a minute. Let me end with this, which is sort of like a lightning round. What keeps you up at night, and what gives you a lot of hope about retirement security? So Katie, specifically related to CalSavers, what keeps you up at night, and what gives you a lot of hope?
Thinking about the timing of our launch, you know, none of us can predict what the markets are going to do, but it would be rather unfortunate to launch and have folks start saving and then, you know, have a market decline. That would be discouraging, I think, for our participants. That's one, but I'm just excited. I think, looking at Oregon's experience and seeing that, they've got tens of thousands of people saving money, over $3 million in the bank, and nothing but positive stories generated. I'm so excited to be in their shoes in a few months, and also just to be, opportunities like this to be with other states that are developing these programs. It's a really neat kind of small but growing community of states that are looking at solving this problem creatively and being sort of the pioneers in this effort. So we're optimistic.
David, you get the last word?
Okay, wow. I'm looking forward to having the other states start to launch, Illinois and California and Maryland, some of the others. And I hope this will take off like the 529 college savings programs, which started very, very small, and now there's billions of dollars in them, highly successful program. Hoping this will be the same thing and maybe somehow could lead to a national solution if somehow the Republicans and Democrats